Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Make sure that you like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff, or you can catch us anywhere you get your podcast from. We have a great live show for you guys today. First and foremost, we need to recap what we've watched since the Four Nations break because it has been an absolutely awful three-game stretch for the Pittsburgh Penguins, and it seems as if they are crash landing into the top 5 of the NHL entry draft. And then we'll discuss the rumors that have been going around this week of a potentially new alternate jersey that we're going to see next season, and we'll close out my portion of this show with the 3 stars of the week before finishing it off as we do every single Wednesday with all of your questions. So if you're tuned in live right now to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh on YouTube, make sure you drop a question in the comment section below. We will get to as many of them as possible before we head out today. But let's continue and start things off really with what we've seen over the last 3 games, because as of right now, the Penguins have been back for the Four Nations for 3 entire games against Metropolitan Division rivals, which makes you wonder, has anybody told the team? Has anybody told the Pittsburgh Penguins that they have played 3 games since they've returned? Simply because it kind of looks like most of them are still sprawled out on a beach somewhere. But jokes aside, the Pens are having a rough go of it since they returned from the Four Nations break. 0-3 against 3 division rivals, being outscored 19-7 over that time. And it all culminated with a 6-1 just beatdown on Broad Street by the Philadelphia Flyers. It was a rough night last night. And when you look at their 3 games since the break, I'm not going to say it's been all negative for them. There have been a couple of moments where you said, all right, well, at the very least, you can get this out of this player. You saw this out of that player, such as the first 20, maybe 25 minutes of the Washington Capitals game. The Penguins looked like they were playing some pretty good hockey, and they looked like maybe, just maybe, they can put something together here in the last stretch of games before the end of the season. And then it all fell apart as the Penguins then lost 8-3. The Rangers game, I have a hard time leaving that against anybody but Joel Blomqvist. The defense played fairly well. They only gave up 15 shots on goal the entire game. The offense was able to get pucks past Igor Shesterkin, but their goaltending just wasn't there. It was a rough night for Joel Blomqvist, and it was very evident that he just wasn't going to be able to catch his footing in that one. And then last night was the worst of the 3 games. It was a game in which the Penguins were outskated, they were out-hit, they were outskilled by a Philadelphia Flyers team that is built primarily of young players trying to get their feet wet at the National Hockey League level. So it was a rough night for the Penguins, and now you look at where they're at in the standings, and I'll get to it in a minute. We had a discussion when we had the Fly Penguins Fly guys on the podcast, and I said, I just don't see their floor being a top 3 pick, being a top 4 pick, because I just don't think that they're going to be able to play poor enough over this final stretch to catch up to the Nashville Predators, the Buffalo Sabres. Well, boy, was I wrong. Boy, was I wrong. They currently sit at the 6th overall slot in the draft lottery, and they are only 2 points ahead of 4th. And that 4th place team is the Buffalo Sabres, who has multiple games in hand. So very easily, the Pittsburgh Penguins could wind up, before the lottery even begins, sitting in the top 5 of the NHL entry draft order. But I mentioned there briefly that during the Four Nations break, we had Jordan DeFigio and Jeff Taylor of the Fly Penguins Fly Game Day podcast on. We did a kind of joint discussion about what the ceiling and what the floor would be for this Pittsburgh Penguins team post the tournament. Everybody said the ceiling is maybe the 2nd or 3rd team out of the playoffs. And I was the only person that seemingly said, I just don't see them falling into the top 3, into the top 4, into the top 5. It felt like 6th or 7th, where they were at the time, was probably the lowest they could go. And a lot of that was because of 2 reasons. The presence of Sidney Crosby, and I think that has been evident still, even though they've lost these 3 games, and the fact that Alex Nedeljkovic was playing well. If you look at what he was doing before the Four Nations and what he's done in 2 games since the Four Nations, it's night and day. And I think there's been other issues. The team defense has been horrendous through most of these games. P.O. Joseph looked awful, and I hate to single anybody out yesterday, but there were a handful of those goals that P.O. Joseph just looked like he was out to lunch on. But the team as a whole is not playing defense well, and Alex Nedeljkovic, his numbers are starting to kind of show that. Before the Four Nations, Alex Nedeljkovic went in a 5-2-1 run over his final 8 games played, had a .934 save percentage, and allowed just 1.8 goals against per game. Since the Four Nations break, and this is discounting Sunday against the New York Rangers when Joel Blomqvist started, and he struggled mightily, Alex Nedeljkovic, who was one of their more impressive players throughout that entire stretch, has been 0-2 with a .784 save percentage and 5.5 goals against average. Ridiculous numbers. Tristan Jarry at the beginning of the year-esque numbers. And it all comes back to this. The Penguins, all season long, have been in the same exact spot with their goaltending. They have not gotten enough out of that position through 80% of this season. And if it continues at this pace, that is when I will bite my tongue. That is when I will admit that I was wrong. The floor has changed. The floor is no longer 6th, 7th in the NHL entry draft lottery. It is 4th. I don't know if they get down to 3rd because I think they have 8 points on the Anaheim Ducks who are down there. Whoever is currently sitting in the 3rd position, I forget. But whoever's sitting there is 8 points behind the Pittsburgh Penguins. I have a hard time believing that they're going to be able to catch them simply because the Pens can lose out. Those teams are also bad too, so I would imagine they're going to lose as well. But there's a real possibility that the Pittsburgh Penguins finish as the 4th worst team in the National Hockey League this year, and that is with Rickard Rakell on pace for a career season. That is with Brian Rust on pace for a career season points-wise. That is with Sidney Crosby still on track to have a point per game and play at least 80 games as of right now this season. And that's with the Pittsburgh Penguins power play advancing from 30th, where they finished last year, all the way into being a top 10 unit this year. I think that just tells you how bad their other areas have gotten. And it makes you wonder, how quickly can the Pittsburgh Penguins turn this around, considering how bad their defense has been, considering how bad their goaltending has been, considering outside of that top line and outside of a few hot stretches from depth players. Phil Tomasino had a hot stretch every once in a while. He had a nice goal yesterday. Evgeni Malkin has had a couple of hot stretches, but again, who's around him? It's hard to stay consistent when you don't have very many people around him. Michael Bunting has had a few hot stretches, but now you look at him, he's sick, but he was demoted down to the 3rd line before he got sick. This team is far away from contending for anything. And the embarrassing showing over the past 5 days is a pure example of that. But it's all not bad news. There is a little bit of good news. There is a little silver lining. And I like to give you guys a silver lining because in the midst of a season like this, it is tough to tune in week in and week out, day in and day out. But there's a silver lining to all of this, and it just comes off the ice. There's been some chatter over this past week about a new alternate potentially coming out for next season. They've had the Pittsburgh Diagonal since 2021, and to this day, it is my favorite. I was going to say probably my favorite, but no, the Pittsburgh Diagonal with black and the gold lettering is my favorite Penguins jersey that I have seen, at least in the Sidney Crosby era. With that said, it would move down if they brought back the gradient. And that is what all of the rumors are. That is what everybody is talking about. That is what everybody is expecting for the 2025-26 season. We got to give a quick shout out to Hooks Orpik at Pittsburgh because he's the one that kind of connected all these dots. But if you look at his article, it looks like he might be onto something. And it all stems down to the fact that the Penguins are starting to kind of regain ties with the Pittsburgh Diagonal. If you're tuned in live on Tip of the Ice-Burgh on YouTube, you see the not the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton Penguins, the Wheeling Nailers did their own version of the gradient. This is Isaac Beliveau posing for pictures here. And I think that this, with the RoboPen logo on Sidney Crosby, would look gorgeous. I think that this is something that Pens fans can get a little excited about. I understand that when you're looking at the on-ice product that you're looking at, that it's tough to get excited about anything. But hey, in a season like this, we got to pick and choose our spots. And this is a spot where I'm going to say, hey, I like what I'm seeing. I like the Wheeling Nailers logo, first of all, fits this perfectly. I think it looked phenomenal with the Wheeling Nailers logo, but at the same time, I think with the Pittsburgh Penguins logo, it'll look great. It's the one logo and jersey combination that we really haven't seen with Sidney Crosby. The only other one that I can think of is the dark blue with the Penguins crest. I don't know if we're going to see that one, but this is the other one that we're missing. The Jaromir Jagr era when he was captain, Robo Pen with the gradient. Now, if we get that, I haven't bought in a jersey in a very long time, but I think that's one that I will have to buy. So let me know in the comment section, what do you think about the Penguins potentially returning to the Robo Pen gradient for the 2025-26 season? And is there a different alternate that you'd like to see before Sidney Crosby calls it quits on his career? Let's close out my portion of this show with the 3 stars of the week. And we can go some directions here. There weren't many options when it came to 3 stars of the week this week, simply because the Penguins, as we talked about at the start of the show, haven't looked good. They've struggled. They've performed poorly over these 3 games since the Four Nations break. But I do have 3 names for you. Let me know in the comment section what 3 names you would put up here, because it's slim pickings from this past weekend. But at number 3, I'm going to start with a defenseman. In 2 games played, he has 2 goals. And those 2 goals were his second and third of his career. And I'm going to give it to Ryan Shea. Defensively, hasn't been as awful as he was before, but the fact that he was out of the lineup for as long as he was, then he went on to the Four Nations break where he didn't play hockey at all for 10 days, and then he comes back and he's a healthy scratch once again, and then he finally gets his opportunity. I thought Ryan Shea was going to score the 2 goals that might just turn the Pittsburgh Penguins around in their post-Four Nations schedule. And then, of course, the goaltending thing happened with Joel Blomqvist, and it all got erased very quickly. But shout out to Ryan Shea, a 2-goal third period against the New York Rangers. Fun fact, he had 1 goal going into that game in his career. I watched that happen down here at Cap One Arena in a massive victory for the Pittsburgh Penguins last spring whenever they were trying to just etch their way into the playoffs. And it just reminded me, whatever happened to Ryan Shea and Jack St. Ivany. I understand St. Ivany had a rough start to this season, but man, it would have been nice to see them build off of what they started late last season. And maybe that's all it was. Maybe late last season, it was just a flash in the pan. These 2 guys are just working for 3 weeks, and it's not going to extend beyond that. But it kind of stinks that we haven't seen that get an opportunity to grow, because if you look at the Penguins' third pairing now, it's a revolving door. Some games Ryan Graves is in, some games it's Vincent Desharnais, some games it's Ryan Shea. Eventually, you'd have to think that we're going to see Vladislav Kolyachonok at some point. And it kind of stings that late last year, it was Jack St. Ivany and Ryan Shea that actually looked like a pairing that you could count on for at the very least this season. And it lasted all of 3 weeks before it crashed and burned, and we have yet to see anything from Jack St. Ivany since. Now, he's had a pretty good year with the Wilkes-Barre Penguins, but hasn't had that other opportunity to come back up to the NHL level, and probably won't for the remainder of this season. But I digress on that point. Ryan Shea is the number 3 star of the week for his 2-goal performance against the New York Rangers. At number 2, 3 games played, 1 goal, 2 assists. I'm going to hand it over to Evgeni Malkin. There were some question marks about how's he going to look coming back from that lower body injury. A lot of us, myself included, thought it was going to be a lot worse than just missing 6 games before the Four Nations break and coming back. But even if he was coming back post-Four Nations, I had questions about how good is he going to look? That's a lower body injury. That's a knee injury to a 37-year-old player that has had knee injuries in the past. Is he going to have jump to him? Is he going to be able to play at full speed? What's he going to look like all in all coming back because of a long layoff for, again, somebody who is fairly long in the tooth in Evgeni Malkin? Well, he's looked really good. He's looked great, in fact. Most of the time that he's out there on the ice, he is a overwhelmingly positive player for the Pittsburgh Penguins, and that's considering who his line mates have been. First game back, it was Michael Bunting and I believe Phil Tomasino. Now it was Danton Heinen and Anthony Beauvillier yesterday, and I believe it was that again on Sunday. So look at what he has to work with. And again, I don't want to keep taking shots at Michael Bunting, but he's clearly struggling with something right now outside of the illness that kept him from practice, and he's not playing at his highest level. Phil Tomasino had a nice goal yesterday and can play some good hockey, but these aren't guys that should be playing established minutes next to Evgeni Malkin. I mean, comparatively, you look at what Malkin has to what Crosby has, and you have to be surprised when Malkin starts to put the puck in the back of the net. Now, he's doing all he can, and I think you have to judge him on his performance alone sometimes, and his performance alone has been very impressive since the Four Nations break. He's proven that lower body injury isn't affecting him any longer. And even yesterday, when he didn't score any points, he didn't get on the scoreboard, and the Penguins as a whole did not look good. I thought Evgeni Malkin created a handful of chances and gave the Penguins at least an opportunity to try to claw back into that game during the late first period, early second period portion before it just got completely out of hand and the Flyers completely embarrassed him. So Evgeni Malkin comes away with the second star of the week, which leaves Sidney Crosby as my first star. I could have gone either way with this one, but I'm going to run Sid as the number one star this week simply because how is this man not exhausted? Josh Yohe wrote an article saying practically the same thing earlier in the week for The Athletic, saying, how is this guy playing? How is this guy not only playing, but showing to have a lot of energy in his game? Because if he's tired, he's not showing it. He plays in a crazy tournament in which he was the oldest player in that tournament. And then 41, not even a full 48, 41 hours later, he plays in a game against the second best team in the National Hockey League, the Washington Capitals, and continues to go on to play 3 games in 4 days, not just in that stretch that ended yesterday, but also in the stretch that starts tomorrow with the Philadelphia Flyers and then a back-to-back on the weekend against the Boston Bruins and the Toronto Maple Leafs. Sidney Crosby is playing a heck of a lot of hockey, and he's doing it at a very, very high level. So you have to give credit where credit is due. A goal and an assist. He was held off the scoreboard yesterday, which is not what you want to see, but at the end of the day, he's still over that point per game, and that is the one last glimmer of anything that I think Penguins fans are holding on to for this season. So there's your 3 stars of the week. Ryan Shea slides in there with his first appearance on the 3 stars with a 2-goal performance against the New York Rangers. Evgeni Malkin gets the 2nd star as he's looked really good coming off of that lower body injury. And Sidney Crosby continues to defy Father Time and continues to impress day in and day out for the Pittsburgh Penguins. But that's going to do it for my portion of this episode of Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live. But as I always do, we'll answer all of your questions. So if you're tuned in live at Tip of the Ice-Burgh on YouTube, make sure you toss your question in the comment section below, and we will get to as many as we can before we head out of here today. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live. I don't know what is going on with my video. Apparently, it doesn't loop anymore. Shout out to Evan for the 2nd straight week. Let me know that I'm just sitting here staring at the screen and you're staring at me stare at the screen. We'll try to avoid that, and we'll try to do that going forward. I got to get that fixed. But we got plenty of questions here. If you have some, drop them in the comment section below. We'll answer as many as we can before we head out of here today. Let's kick it off with Evan, who says, again, dropping my question in early, does P.O. Joseph play the next game after an abysmal night against the Philadelphia Flyers? And why hasn't Kolyachonok gotten an opportunity? The second half of that question, I couldn't tell you. When they acquired him via the waivers, I thought, all right, well, this is at the very least a replacement for Ryan Shea. At the very least, it's somebody that can come in and get an opportunity as a younger piece to be your seventh defenseman, a little bit of a tryout for Kolyachonok. And yet, they go back to Graves Desharnais to start, and it doesn't look good against the Washington Capitals. And then I think, all right, well, there. Now they will finally put in the new kid, and they put in Ryan Shea. I don't know if it is the loyalty that Mike Sullivan has to the players that have been here. I don't know if they just don't think he's quite ready to step into this system yet. I don't know what it is. So I don't have an answer for you as to why Kolyachonok hasn't gotten an opportunity. As far as P.O. Joseph, that's a tough one, because who's going to play with Erik Karlsson? Or sorry, not Erik Karlsson. Matt Grzelcyk will play with Erik Karlsson, but who's going to play with Kris Letang? Are you going to put Ryan Graves up there? Because that never worked. I mean, they tried it last year for the first 20 games, and it was awful. And then they tried it again at some point this year, and again, it was awful. They've been keeping Ryan Graves on the third pairing or out of the lineup. So are they going to put him up there? I wouldn't think so. Are they going to go from having Kolyachonok being a healthy scratch in favor of Ryan Shea to having Kolyachonok be your top pairing defenseman alongside Kris Letang? I would be surprised. So I don't think P.O. Joseph gets taken out of the lineup, although he did have himself a really bad game. The one goal that he gave up where he was trying to deflect the pass out of the crease with his skate instead of either utilizing his stick to clear up the passing lane or just getting the guy out from literally basically inside the net. It was a bad game. And when they initially reacquired him, I said, it's not a bad move if you're going to utilize him the correct way. And the correct way has always been as a third pairing defenseman. He is not good enough, at least not at this present moment. And he may turn it around at some point because defensemen sometimes take longer to develop, but I feel like we're at the end of that rope, and he hasn't proven that he can handle 20, 22 plus minutes a night alongside a player like Kris Letang. So I understand their options are limited, which is why I answered the first part as, yeah, they're probably not going to take him out of the lineup, but he's not going to succeed in that role because he hasn't succeeded in that role yet. And he's at the point now where I'm not sure there's very much left on that bone that you can count on for him to come with something new. Let's go to Football Goat CR7, who says, who do you think will be traded next? I think what we're all seeing now is that it's very likely that the Pittsburgh Penguins are going to move on from multiple people if they can. Again, the market has to be there. Other teams have to look at your pieces and say, yeah, that could help us out. If you've watched the Pittsburgh Penguins the last 3 games, there's not very many pieces on that roster that I would watch and simply say, yeah, I think that's going to help my team get to a Stanley Cup. And the ones that are probably not for sale. Guys like Rickard Rakell, guys like Brian Rust, guys like Sidney Crosby. That's most of, if not all of the list right now. So who do I think will be traded next? The one that I think is most likely is Matt Grzelcyk. He's a guy that has been very successful on the power play this year. His defensive work has come a long way since that first 17, 18 game stretch where he looked like he was way worse than Ryan Graves was when he first started with the Pittsburgh Penguins. But Grzelcyk has kind of turned it around a little bit. He's had a much better season than a lot of people anticipated. And I think because of that, there's going to be some value around the NHL. And I think the fact that he has an expiring contract and he's shown that he can play with a star player in Erik Karlsson and the results aren't horrendous, I think he's going to have some value, and I think he's the most likely to get traded. Outside of that, there have been rumors about Erik Karlsson. Elliot Friedman talked about it a little bit. Josh Yohe put it in The Athletic yesterday, I believe it was, that if Kyle Dubas could trade Erik Karlsson, he would do it in a heartbeat, which is crazy to think, considering a year and a half ago, that was Kyle Dubas's big home run swing to get this team back into the playoffs and back into contention. But alas, that's where they reportedly are at with Erik Karlsson. I don't think that move gets done in 9 days at this point. I think that is likely a summertime move, simply because I just don't know if anybody's going to be willing to take on that contract. And I'm not sure how willing the Pittsburgh Penguins are going to be to retain salary on that contract, because Kyle Dubas, the one thing he's been most consistent with is he doesn't want to retain salary. He doesn't want to do buyouts. And that's going to be probably the only way you're getting Erik Karlsson off the books, is retaining salary. But I do think, if I'm saying who's next to be traded, I think it's most likely going to be a guy like Matt Grzelcyk. Let's go to Evan, who says, Matt Nieto just got dropped on waivers per Elliot Friedman. I trust you, but I'm going to double check this, because I don't think I ever expected to see the day that he was dropped on waivers. And he was. Like, I trust you, Evan, but I always like to double check before I talk about things. But Matt Nieto on waivers, it's been a long time coming, right? Does anybody think they needed to see more of Matt Nieto before he became an unrestricted free agent this summer? Because he's not somebody that's going to get traded. There's no value there. And he's not somebody that the Penguins are going to bring back. So what do? They put him on waivers. They'll send him down to Wilkes-Barre, and hopefully it opens up a spot for a young, talented player to come up and get an opportunity. That's what the rest of this season is about. And again, I'm not sure how many people and how many players you can expect to get called up. I would imagine you're not going to see every name that you're excited about in Wilkes-Barre make the jump to the NHL level late this year, but there's going to be a couple, and this might just open things up for the Pittsburgh Penguins with Matt Nieto placed on waivers. Let's go to Football Goat again, who says, if we trade Erik Karlsson, what do you think the return will be? I still think the return for Karlsson, and again, the big bugaboo about this is the Penguins need to retain salary. There's 2 more years at $10 million on Erik Karlsson's contract. The Pens are going to have to retain some of that. Would they be willing to eat $2.5 million on the salary cap for the next 2 years to open up $7.5 million in salary cap space and potentially a spot on the right side of the line or the right side of the defense? Maybe. But I think if they're willing to retain, that trade still includes a first-round pick. Because I think a lot of people see that if Erik Karlsson is in the right situation, and if Erik Karlsson is on the right team, that he still has the talent, he still has the ability to take over hockey games. He did it at the Four Nations. And while no team is going to be as talented as Team Sweden is, just in general, if you put him in the right situation, I know that it was kind of refuted by the Dallas Stars GM Jim Nill, but Elliot Friedman said that the Dallas Stars would be a interesting landing spot if it were to happen. And again, he was just showing an opinion. And it's a good opinion, because if you dropped Erik Karlsson onto a team like the Dallas Stars, who already has that defensive structure built up, he probably succeeds, because you can kind of take the reins off a little bit. If you're in the Penguins defensive core right now, you have a lot of pressure to stay within the structure. And I just don't think that's meshing well with Erik Karlsson's style. If he goes to a team like the Stars, where he doesn't have to, 1, be the star, and 2, try to play defense, then he's probably going to perform better. He's probably going to score more. He's probably going to create better offense. So I do think there's going to be teams that see that and see what he did at Four Nations. And I think there's still going to be a price of a first-round pick, especially if the Penguins end up retaining salary. Outside of the first, I don't know what else is thrown in there. Maybe another NHL player to help offset the salary cap, but it's probably not going to be a good one. It's probably not going to be a young one. I mean, yeah, would it be great if the Penguins could say, give us a first and Wyatt Johnston for Erik Karlsson? It'd be fantastic, but the Stars would never do that. So I do think it includes a first. I do think they'd have to take some salary back, and then maybe you get another piece. But again, that's depending upon the market. I'm not sure it's quite that high. Let's go to Brian, who says, Belsky, if the Penguins can unload Karlsson, sensing a theme here, convince me they can't return to the playoffs sooner rather than later. They will have a lot of cash and tons of picks to use or deal for NHLers. Am I crazy? I'm not going to be able to convince you that they can't, because with all of that at your disposal, you can certainly build a contender quickly. But will the Penguins is the first question, and will they do it well is the second question. because you can offload and you can gather picks all you want. It's the execution whenever you have all of that that is going to determine how quick this rebuild ends up being. You can clear out all the cap space you want, but if you spend $12 million on a player that doesn't fit, then you're not going to go anywhere, and you might go further down the toilet than you already are. So I can't convince you that they can't. All I will say is they are far away right now, because while Malkin in spurts plays at a very high level, over an 82-game slate, he just hasn't been able to produce like a second-line center. Sidney Crosby's been fine. Brian Rust has been good. Crosby's been better than fine. Crosby's been good. Rust has been good. Raquel has been good. The power play has, by one way or another, worked. But outside of that, there is a lot of damage control to do, especially on the blue line and in net. I think what you're seeing from Blomqvist is not what you're going to get throughout his career. I think that he obviously has plenty of room to grow. But Alex Nedeljkovic has shown you his best version. And that was the 8 games before the Four Nations face-off. The Penguins won a handful of those games. They were 5-2-1, but he's still not able to do that on a consistent basis. Tristan Jarry is still a major question mark that I'm not sure I would put faith in going into the future. Yes, Sergei Murashov looks like he's an absolute animal, and he's tearing up the ECHL, and he's doing the same when he's getting opportunities in the AHL, but he's still at least a year to 2 years, at least 2 to 3 years. Let me adjust that. 2 to 3 years away from even making it to the NHL, let alone establishing himself at the NHL level. I just think you have so many issues that unless you hit every single move, every draft pick, every free agent signing, every trade, unless you hit them all out of the park 100%, it's going to be very hard for this team to quickly turn the tide. I don't think it happens next season. At least nothing that I'm looking at right now makes me believe that it could happen next season. I think once you see the moves that happen in the next week here leading into the deadline, the moves that happen throughout all of this summer, and you see what happens next year and how some of these young guys like Ponomarev, Koivunen, Rutger McGroarty, Owen Pickering, see how they adjust to the NHL game, because we're going to get those answers here next season more than likely. Then I think you can reassess how will they be in 26, 27. Because I think that this year is obviously a lost cause. Next year, it's a steep hill to climb to get them back into contention for a playoff spot. And that's where I think they're at right now. They do have the funds. They will have the draft capital. They will have the ability to trade for NHLers or trade for better players or sign better players. While they have all of that, again, they have to be able to hit it out of the park. And Dubas has done a lot of good things. But let's not forget, the last time he had all that capital, he went out and he signed Ryan Graves to a 6-year deal that looks awful just 2 years into it. He went out and he signed Tristan Jarry, which I will still argue that that was the only player to sign, but it still backfired in his face. And even if there is a top free agent available in a position of need for the Penguins, they go out, they pay for the guy because everybody agrees he's the top guy. It might not work in Pittsburgh. And that's why I'm not willing to sit here and say that they can turn it around by next year. And I think there's a lot of question marks once you get to that following season. Let's go to Mitch, who says, coming off the Four Nations, it is possible, but the Penguins could retain at least half of the salary. That is in reference to Erik Karlsson. I don't think they'd retain half. If the Penguins are retaining, the most I could see them retaining, especially considering they'd have to retain for 2 years after this one, I think the Penguins at most would retain 2.5. That's just my personal opinion, but I do think that that's where they're going to end up going if they have to retain. Let's move over to Jim, who says, given the goalie situation, do we see any other goalies getting a peak this season? No. Not at the NHL level. No, I think what you see right now is what you're going to get with the Penguins for the goaltending situation. You're going to see a combination of Alex Nedeljkovic and Blomqvist for the rest of the season. I don't think they're going to move on from Alex Nedeljkovic at the trade deadline unless somebody comes calling with a crazy offer, which his performance in the last 2 games is probably going to nullify any of that. Goalies don't get moved very often anyway before the deadline, but I think what you see is what you're going to get as far as the placement of the goaltenders in the organization for the rest of this year. It's going to be Blomqvist and Ned, hopefully at a 50-50 split. That's what I think should happen. And then at the AHL level, you're going to see Philip Larson get the lion's share of the starts, with Tristan Jarry backing up and playing a handful of games here and there. And then you're going to see Sergei Murashov stay at the ECHL level. I think that's what you're going to have, simply because the Penguins right now are valuing playing time, especially for the three younger guys, especially for Larson and Murashov and Blomqvist. And the best way to do that is to have them spread out between the three leagues, and so each of them can get the playing time that they need to develop and get better. Let's go to Brandon, who says, removing the draft order and taking the best player available aspect, what player in the top 5 do you think would fit within the Penguins the best to help accelerate the retool effort? Well, either way, if they end up with a top 5 pick, they're getting a very good player, because while this draft is not deep and this draft is not one that everybody expects to kind of pop off outside of the top 5, those first 5 players are going to be very good in this draft. Let me try to pull up a list here for top prospects in the 2025, not 2095, 2025 NHL draft. I'm trying to think. I don't want to miss one of the names, but I know obviously Porter Martone, Michael Misa, James Hagens, and why can't I think of his name? Matthew Schaefer are kind of thought of as the top 4, top 5. McQueen is up there. Frundell is up there. I would say of these players, the one that I think would fit the Pittsburgh Penguins the most is probably Porter Martone when it comes to best player available. And again, I've watched very little. Started to watch a little bit, but I've watched still very little of the 2025 class. But at the same time, the Pens need centers. They do. And when you're looking at centers, it's kind of hard to go away from Misa or go away from Hagens. I think that they really, really need centers. And I know a lot of people are going to say, well, they've needed defense for a while. But if you look at the work they've done over the past year, 2 years since Dubas came in, the defense has looked really good. Harrison Brunick looks like he is potentially a player. Owen Pickering has taken strides and is ready much quicker than a lot of people expected. Finn Harding, as a 7th-round pick, is tearing up the OHL. So it feels like right now they've done a good job to set a base for the defense, but I think they really need that headline center, because Tristan Brose is good. Vasily Ponomarev is good. They've had great years at the AHL, but neither of them project to be a first-line center. I'm not sure either of these guys. I would say they're not guaranteed to become a first-line center, but you really need to add center depth to your prospect pool. So I think I would go with either Misa or Hagens as of right now. Let's jump over to Mark, who says, what do you think the ceilings are for Blomqvist and Murashov? What current NHL goalies would you compare their ceilings to? Oh, this is a good one, because the situation feels eerily similar to what we saw a couple years back with the New York Rangers. But I'm not going to say the ceiling for Sergei Murashov is the same as the ceiling for Igor Shesterkin. But it feels like Joel Blomqvist's ceiling is a very solid starting goaltender in the NHL. Not one that's ever going to be in the Vezina race, but somebody that can start 40, 45 games. I think that's really where you see most goaltenders at this point. Start half of your season and be able to be a solid starting goaltender, similar to what Alexander Georgiev was whenever he came out for the New York Rangers. And I think Murashov's the guy. I really do. It's early. There's a lot of room to grow. There's a lot of time to see whether or not he can continue to grow as he gets into more difficult competition. But Murashov feels like the Shesterkin comp. Maybe not that level, but it feels like he's the guy that you can look at as the future of the goaltending room for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Blomqvist, listen, he was great last year. When I say great, he was extremely great last year for the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins. It hasn't gone his way at the NHL level. Part of that is things that are out of his control. The defense in front of him, the forwards not being able to kind of capitalize on opportunities in front of him to get him bigger leads. And some of it is just the fact that he's a 23-year-old goaltender that has played 13 NHL games and isn't quite adjusted to the speed of the game yet. That glove hand is a little slow getting up there. So I still think that Blomqvist's ceiling is potentially a starter in this league, but I think Murashov, if you're going to look at which one is the guy that has the higher ceiling, I think that's him. And I really, again, It might not be a great comparison one-to-one when it comes to Georgiev and Blomqvist and then Shesterkin and Mershov. I don't think the talent is quite at the same level, but it feels like it's the same scenario where everybody's going to look at Blomqvist. If he kind of pops off here late this season, they're going to say, wow, the Penguins might have their guy in Blomqvist. Might. And then everybody in Pittsburgh is going to say, well, hold on, because there's another guy coming down the pike that is even better. That was what was told to me whenever Shesterkin was coming up and Georgiev was playing well in relief of Henrik Lundqvist in New York. I think that's what Penguins fans are going to get to say a lot about Sergei Mershov in the coming years. Let's go down to Brian, who says, Belsky, do you blame Rob Lowe as much as I do for hockey still being a niche sport in the States? His movie Youngblood set hockey back decades. I remember watching that. Again, it has been a long time since I've watched Youngblood, but the last time I remember watching it was in the middle of the Stanley Cup playoffs. I don't remember what year. I think it was either 2005, or it wasn't 2005. There was no Stanley Cup playoffs in 2005, but either 2006 or 2004. And it was when Versus was still a thing. If you remember the channel Versus, that's what they were playing Youngblood on. And I just remember watching it, even at that age, at like 11. And I was like, this is not good. This is not good at all. Like, I did not like the movie. So it's funny that you bring it up. I have not heard a Youngblood reference in a very, very long time. So shout out to Brian for bringing that one back. Let's go to Mickey, who says, who would you want or need to get through the deadline? The Penguins aren't buying anything. They're not. I mean, the only players that they've ever been kind of tied to were these Phil Tomasino-esque players. Guys like Brant Clark of the LA Kings, who was back in the lineup on Monday. So we'll have to wait and see what the jury does on that one, if he's actually on the block or if he's not. Guys like Trevor Zegras, who just got suspended. So again, you know, a lot of news around these guys. Nick Robertson is another name. Nils Hoglander is another name. Those are the type of guys the Penguins might be interested in, but at the deadline, those types of deals just don't typically happen. I think if you're looking at the Penguins over the next 9 days, you're looking at them as a hardline seller, and that is what they're going to be. They're going to try to sell off as many pieces as they can that are not named Sidney Crosby, Brian Rust, Evgeni Malkin. Anybody with a no move clause is not going to get moved in the next 9 days. And that includes Erik Karlsson. I really, this could be old takes exposed. I really don't care, but I really don't think, as I sit here today, that Erik Karlsson is going anywhere in the next 9 days. So if you're looking at the Penguins, you got to look at them as a seller. There's not going to be there might be one, but outside of that, there's not going to be any other new faces that come to the Pittsburgh Penguins and play at the NHL level via the trade deadline in 9 days. Let's go to Christopher Hart, who says, are we re-signing Vasily Ponomarev? He's an RFA at the end of the season. I would imagine they're going to re-sign him because they haven't given him an opportunity to show what he can do at the NHL level, and he's an RFA. So one, it's not going to cost you very much. Two, there's nobody else that's going to bump up the price. And three, this is a guy that the organization has been so excited about since they acquired him in the Jake Gensel trade. And he's played all of maybe 4 games at most at the NHL level, while being very, very good at the American Hockey League level and proving that he's adapting to that bottom 6 style that he's going to need to play when he gets to the NHL level. I think that Ponomarev should come up post deadline and just play third line center. Move Kevin Hayes either to wing or down to fourth line center and put Vasily Ponomarev at 3C and let him go. See what he's got. But I do think that even if he comes up and struggles a little bit, the Penguins are going to take their chance to re-sign him because it's not going to cost that much money when the guy has played less than 10 NHL games in his entire career. Let's go to Bradley Vision, who says, do we see any offer sheets from Kyle Dubas in the summer? I think the odds point to no, because we rarely see offer sheets in general. Last offseason, we were treated to a double-decker special, which the Penguins were slightly in connection with the St. Louis Blues whenever they offer sheeted for Dylan Holloway and for Philip Broberg of the Edmonton Oilers. The Penguins, of course, a couple of trades back and forth to make sure the St. Louis Blues had the draft capital that they needed to give away to pull off those offer sheets, but it's something that doesn't happen very often at all. So I don't think that we'll see it from Kyle Dubas. That, although is always an option that a lot of people ask, why don't they do it more often? So maybe we see it. I don't think there's, as of right now, any players that I can think of off the top of my mind that would kind of fit the bill for Dubas. And I also don't think Kyle Dubas is going to be willing to, one, you got to overpay for the guy because the other team has to not match. And two, you have to then give away draft capital. And it's usually draft capital that's worth more than just trading for the player in the first place. Let's go to Mitch, who says, where and when do you see Rutger slotting in? My co-host on Tip of the Ice-Burgh, Nick Horwat, said that he could see Rutger coming up later this season, that he wouldn't be surprised if he saw him. I feel like the timeline is more set out for next year. And probably if he has a good training camp to start the season next year at the NHL level. And I would imagine if they do that, they're going to start him exactly where they started him this year, and that's on the third line. That's a middle six role where he can build the same way that he built this year. Start with this role, see how you can handle it, adjust to the NHL game, and then get better over time. That's what he did down in the AHL this year. Now, he didn't start in the third line, but he started with much less ice time per game from Kirk McDonald and the crew. And since then, he's just climbed and built and built and built. And now, more often than not, he is among the team leaders in ice time every single game for the Wilkes-Barre Penguins. So I see the same thing happening in Pittsburgh. He's a guy that has the upside to potentially be a top six winger at the National Hockey League level, but I don't think they're just going to throw him to the wolves, per se, to start next year. I think you see him early next season if he has a good training camp, and I think you see him in that bottom six, but more so as a middle six option, not just a third or fourth line option. Let's go to Flux CC. Shout out, Matt. Says, do you give Avery Hayes an NHL contract if you're Kyle Dubas? I've enjoyed watching Avery Hayes. He made a statement at the Prospects Challenge in Buffalo and has continued to do so throughout this season. He's somebody that if you don't give an NHL contract to, he's probably going to get one elsewhere because he has been that good in the minors this year. So if I'm Kyle Dubas, depending on how many roster spots you have available, because there is only 50 and you do have to be selective with that, I would think about giving Avery Hayes an opportunity here. Now, let me look up the Penguins Puckpedia. Let me see who, as far as minor league contracts, are coming off the books this year and see how many they'll have. As of right now, the Penguins have utilized 49 of their 50 contract slots, so they only have one available now. Emil Bemstrom's an RFA. I could see him not coming back. Una Koppanen's a UFA. I could see him not coming back. Yeah, I'm trying to look at some of these other names, and yeah, I feel like with those couple coming off, Taylor Gauthier comes off. As he end up going somewhere else because he's really not getting an opportunity in this organization? I think that if there's a spot available, you 100% give Avery Hayes an NHL contract. Let's go to Pittsburgh fan 412, who says, sorry if this has been asked. I'm late to the show. Is Blomqvist going to get the net for an extended look, not just these spot starts? I'm hoping that's what the case is, because before the break, whenever Blomqvist was called up in favor of Tristan Jarry, he was called up and the first opportunity was given to Alex Nedeljkovic. I think that was a tip of the cap by the coaching staff to say, hey, listen, you've been here all year. You've been fighting through it with us. We're going to let you get the first opportunity. And he played really well. I mentioned it at the outset of the show. Going into the Four Nations face-off break, he was 5-2-1, had a .934 save percentage, and was allowing 1.8 goals against per game. If that's the case, we've seen time and time again that Mike Sullivan prefers to ride the hot hand. So I think that's what it was, more so than them saying, hey, it's just going to be Ned's net. It was more, he's playing really well right now. Why would we take him out and kind of stop that momentum when he's been playing this well? Considering the fact that Ned has now played 2 games and looked awful through 2 games, has a sub 800 save percentage through 2 games since the break, I think you're going to start to see it a little bit more 50-50. And if it's not, then some massive questions need to be getting asked to Kyle Dubas and to Mike Sullivan. But I do think that now that the playing field is even, there isn't no hot hand in net, I think you're going to start to see Yo Blomqvist a lot more than just the spot starts here and there and the second half of back-to-backs. Let's go to Brian, because I want to highlight this, says one place we know Rutger doesn't fit is enforcer. Yeah, if you haven't seen it yet, I'd say go back and look at it, but if you want to have a high opinion of Rutger McGroarty, maybe don't go back and look at it. I still have a very high opinion of him, but like Brian says here, let's not have him drop the gloves anytime soon. He got absolutely pounded over the weekend in his first professional fight. It looked like he acquiesced to it because he bumped into the goaltender, and you know the unwritten rule in hockey, you touch the goaltender, I'm going to punch you in the face. So he acquiesced to the request. He dropped the gloves, which, hey, you got to commend the kid. He knew that, hey, this is what's going to happen. I'll stand up. I'll see what happens. Obviously answer the bell, but he got absolutely throttled. So yeah, Brian, let's not see Rutger McGroarty drop the gloves anytime soon. Let's go to Bradley Vision, who says, any shot we can see a Demko Jarry trade, or is it even something that should be considered? It's not, because I don't even have to look into Thatcher Demko, who I know is not having the greatest season for the Vancouver Canucks, because I know on the Penguins side of things, nobody wants to touch Tristan Jarry. There's no market for him whatsoever. If any of the other 31 NHL GMs are looking at Tristan Jarry as somebody that they think they can fix, then they have, I mean, we know GMs have a God complex already, but they have an uncurable God complex. That's where Jarry is right now. This is his second stint at the American Hockey League, and nobody's going to touch that when he has 3 years left at $5+ million on the contract. So while it's an interesting hypothetical, I don't think any hypothetical involving Tristan Jarry is something that has any realm of reality right now, because I don't think any GM in the NHL right now has any interest in looking at Tristan Jarry for more than a second. Let's go to Dabton, who says, with Nieto on waivers, if he were to be claimed and or clears and gets sent down, I would imagine it's the latter, but you never know. And in a dream scenario, call up one of the youngsters, who would be your pick to call up? I'll say it again. Vasily Ponomarev. The Penguins could probably use Owen Pickering right now. They could probably use somebody other than P.O. Joseph to play with Kris Letang, but I'm calling up Vasily Ponomarev because I think it makes the most sense. Pittsburgh fan 412 throws out Ville Koivunen. I'm excited to see Koivunen too, but I just don't think it's that time yet. Jason Spezza talked to Matt Wenzel of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette last weekend, and in so many words said, don't expect all of the kids to come up late this year. Expect a lot of them to stay at the AHL level because they're trying to avoid what happened to Spezza early in his career. When he was a prospect, he bounced between the Senators AHL affiliate and the NHL Senators. And he said that wasn't working. It was ruining his development. It was slowing him down. It was hurting his confidence, being bounced back and forth because he could never get his feet underneath him. He could never work on what he needed to work on because he was always adjusting to the level of play because he kept getting bounced back and forth. The Penguins, again, shout out to Matt Wenzel. You should go check out the full article because Spezza goes into detail about some of these individual players. And I will not say that I'll leave for you to go read. But Spezza is saying they're looking to avoid that they want these guys when they come up to stay at the NHL ready. They want them to be ready. They don't want them to come up for 4 games and say, well, it doesn't look great, but we'll send them back down. And Pittsburgh fan also said, he said dream scenario. And I understand it. Ville Koivunen is an exciting player. So I'm not gonna throw you under the bus too much. I just saying that's probably why you're not going to see Koivunen, although I like the fact that he's your dream scenario. To go back to Dabden's question, to me, it's Ponomarev because that's a player that you can bring up. You can slot in right away as a third-line center. You can play him with Phil Tomasino, and if Michael Bunting is still in the bottom 6, you can play him with Michael Bunting as well. But if not, you can play him with Danton Heinen. And I look at that third line and I say, all right, those are pieces that, while not phenomenal, those are pieces that are bona fide, established NHL players and guys that actually fit a third line mold, and then see what Vasily Ponomarev can do. Because as of right now, I mean, going into next year, it's either Kevin Hayes or Vasily Ponomarev as your third line center. You can make the argument for Blake Lizotte, but I think the Pittsburgh Penguins are much better off keeping Blake Lizotte as your fourth line center big if here, you actually give him talented players around him. Nola Chari, I'm sorry, it feels like that goose is cooked. Matt Nieto is on waivers for obvious reasons, but has spent a lot of the season playing on Blake Lizotte's wing. If you get Lizotte some actual fourth line wingers. I think he is a perfect fourth line center, which is why he might be on the trade block. I don't know. That's an interesting name. We'll have to keep an eye on him over the next, 9 days. But Ponomarev and Kevin Hayes are your third line center options as of right now for next year. I would love to see Ponomarev get that opportunity, especially because it feels like he's ready for it. To go back to what Spezza was saying, it feels like he is ready to come up to the NHL, get that opportunity to not play 7 minutes a night, but to play in a role that he's actually built for, which is third line center, which is 12 to 15, which is special teams, specifically on the penalty kill, and watch him go. And I think that's what I want to see for the Pittsburgh Penguins if they're bringing up one of the young guns in favor of Matt Nieto when he potentially clears waivers and gets sent down. Let's go to Flux CC, who says, do we bring back Philip Hollander next season to Wilkes-Barre or Pittsburgh? He's been really good in the SHL the past 2 seasons, and we do still own him. He's a restricted free agent after this year. So who knows? He's a restricted free agent now. So who knows what they end up doing with him? Something tells me Hollander wasn't all that happy with the Penguins organization, which is why he went back to Europe, why he went back to the SHL, because he felt that he wasn't getting the opportunity. He wasn't getting the development that he thought he should in Pittsburgh. So I'm not sure where that entire relationship lies, especially considering when he went over, it was an entirely different organization. It was an entirely different front office. So what does this front office think of Philip Hollander? I'm not sure, because nobody's asked him, because nobody's thought of Philip Hollander, but I would be interested to see if there is anything left to kind of mend between Philip Hollander and the Penguins organization. Somebody I have not thought of in a while. Let's finish it off with Brandon here, who says, do you think Bros has a shot at second line center, maybe moving Malkin to wing? I think that Bros becoming an established second line center by the time Evgeni Malkin, or before Evgeni Malkin retires, is pushing it. I think that Bros is not going to be ready this year. I think he's had a great year at the AHL level. He's certainly taking massive strides between last year in college and this year in his first professional season. But I think next year's a year where he probably doesn't make the team out of camp, and he probably doesn't have the door open unless he has a tremendous training camp. And then you probably don't see him till a little bit later in the season next year. And if that's the case, I don't see him climbing all the way up to second line center. And I think that next year's Malkin's last season in the NHL. Again, just my personal opinion, just what I would believe. But maybe one day. I think he still needs to take strides. I think he still needs to develop. I think that is the ceiling for Tristan Bros. I don't see him being a first-line center. But again, time can change things. Development can change, and people can far exceed expectations year in and year out. He's done that the last 2 years, which is why he's back to being, first and foremost, he wasn't a center before last year. Now he's a center and a guy that I think is looked at as, at best, second-line center. We'll see what he's able to do with the rest of this season, what he's able to do in the playoffs this year, because that is going to be a big determining factor as to how this organization sees a lot of these young guys and what he's able to do over the summer and in training camp. But that's going to do it for this episode of Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this one. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh, or you can catch us anywhere you get your podcast from. We'll see you guys next time.